Good afternoon.
Good
Welcome.
afternoon.
And it's my pleasure today to introduce Tom Ehrenshorst, who's going to talk to us about moral dilemma in fiction. In particular, the book For Whom the Bell Tolls by Hemingway. And if you don't know Tom, I'm going to tell you something about him. HASC member Tom Ehrenshorst grew up in Holland, graduated from DePauw University, the University of Michigan Medical School, and practiced as an ophthalmic surgeon in Holland for 27 years. Tom has served many foreign medical missions and the boards of 5 Holland nonprofit agencies, helping disadvantaged families and youth, and developed and led a wilderness experiential program for the Boys and Girls Club of Greater Holland. Tom then earned an MA in International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame and taught peace studies at Hope from 2015 through 2019. He earned an MFA in creative writing at the Vermont College of Fine Arts in 2016. Tom is the husband of the Reverend Dr. Sharon Ehrenshorst, father of 2 sons, and grandfather of 4 grandsons. I can just say, I think he's an overachiever.
I like school.
And I think we're in for a treat today. So here's Tom.
Thank you. Well,
Oh, by the way, if
got
you
that.
have cell phones, can you silence them? And if you're at home and you're monkeying around, emptying the dishwasher or something, just like, don't let us watch you.
Oh, you keep that.
Oh, yeah.
Yep. Thank you, Amy. And hi, everybody. Well, thank you for coming, and I'm pleased that you're here and all you Zoomers. I'm going to wear a mask because I've had a cough. I was tested of COVID negative still, but I've got this kind of lingering cough, so I'll keep the mask on. I'm pleased that you're here. I hope that you enjoyed reading or looking through the summary of For Whom the Bell Tolls. I'd like to talk with you today about reading, about reading fiction. When I read fiction, I'm interested in the story that's being told, and I'm also curious about how the author is making the story worthwhile for me to read. What makes fiction effective and successful? Let's say you're a fictional character named Cliff, walking through a wooded park at night, and you encounter a man assaulting a woman. You shout, the man turns and attacks you and steals your wallet and with your money and your credit cards and your ID, and he takes off, but he's limping and he can't run fast. What do you do first? Do you check to see if the woman's okay, whom you don't know, or do you go after the thief who's taken your wallet and attacked you? Or let's say you're a fictional character named Sally, a divorced single mother confronted by financial constraints. Your 22-year-old son, who struggles with some cognitive and emotional disabilities, lives with you at home, but has followed some unsavory friends into drug use. How will you respond? How much tough love? How much expensive intervention and therapy? How much loving forgiveness? We're all readers of fiction. My intention for this class is to accent a helpful or maybe even important approach to encountering fiction through awareness of how characters face and engage moral dilemmas. My thesis for our class is that moral dilemma and choice is a crucially central part of every story. Now, if we open the PowerPoint, I just want to kind of hear from you and from everybody Zooming what you think about this thesis. Do you think that moral dilemmas and choices really are centrally important to the success of fiction or to the excellence of fiction, or do you disagree? Do you think that it's not that big a deal? Well, what thoughts have you had as you've approached this class? Ann? Oh, yes, we need the microphone. Oh, yeah, okay, Kath.
Totally agree. We want something to be at stake. And if someone is just falling off a cliff and we hope he makes it, there's really nothing at stake. He'll either land or not, but he doesn't have any choice once he fell off the cliff. We want to see what somebody does when they're backed into a corner and they have different they have some control and they're also not completely in control.
Thank you. Yeah. And we're going to use the mic. We will use the mic.
I guess I put the fiction that I read into two categories, one being more toward the serious end, and then some is just purely escapist. And on the escapist end, maybe the morality is not as much of an issue. Or on the other hand, possibly in that sort of literature, the main character is such a moral person that there isn't really any any wiggle room, that
Mhm.
you don't have you have a black and white situation. So yes, I think on the more serious literature, it's as someone said, it's awfully important.
Yeah, thank you. Yes. And then two more.
For one thing, I think fiction would be dull without it because their characters can't be really developed if they have no set of priorities. What's important to them? What would they do or not do? And so the character development, I think, depends a lot on what makes this person who they are. And then finally builds the story with the conflicts and decisions, et cetera. So, and I think this particular novel is one you could probably read a chapter a day and still read it over again.
Mhm. Yeah, Diana?
Tom, I
Yeah.
agree with you that the moral dilemma is foundational to fiction, going back to Shakespeare and reading all his plays. There's always a moral dilemma faced by the protagonist. However, here's what I want to ask you. I find that war novels may be somewhat outliers outside of that, because war is different. In war, the moral dilemma is, are you going to follow orders or not? Are you going to win the war or not? That's why I was kind of surprised when you chose this as illustrative of your theme. And so that's what I'm interested to find out from you. I find them different.
Okay.
Beyond liking that kind of fiction, I think we seek it. In fact, at this day and age, with the power of internet, or the more you read, the more you discover, you tend to look for themes and it attracts you to a novel. And so there's a whole thread of whether you're looking at a hero or hero's code or hero's journey or something, you tend to resonate with those themes and you come back to them time and time again. So it's almost like you're attracted to a genre in terms of what you want to read, because it reinforces the things you're looking for.
Yeah. And your point brings up how much our own moral decision-making gets involved with the characters and with the dilemmas. Sometimes we may disagree with what they do, whether what a person does or agree, but it's part of what involves us in a story. Any other thoughts? Yes.
As a chaplain, we talked about moral injury in relation to people who were in the different wars were engaged in or have been engaged in, and how it put people in a situation such as in this novel where they had to do things that they would normally find something dishonorable. And obviously you see that conflict in all the characters here in the story. And of course, this is a big driver of PTSD and suicide in the military.
That's right. I mean, soldiers spend the first parts of their lives before they're in the military coming to understand that caring for other people is important, and murder's bad, and lives are important. And then in military, your purpose, lots of can be killing other people, and that's really that really traumatizes people's moral sense. You're highlighting the understanding of the word moral, and that's really kind of my next point is to talk about what moral means. In order to make my case, I'm going to spend a couple minutes talking about moral and moralism, these two words, and how people make personal choices about values and what's right to do. And then we'll look at some of these moral dilemmas and choices and for whom the bell tolls. Well, moral is a big, heavy word. It's defined as having to do with values, ethics, and justice. Moral is that which arises from the deepest, kind of most highly prized values, expressing choices based on one's own sense of justice, what's right. And we don't all have the same view of what's just and right. Moral and ethical have the same definition in multiple sources having to do with rightness of action that each individual must determine. What one person considers morally right may be different from what another person would judge. And it's my thesis that moral dilemma and choice are important in fiction, really crucially important. But this is not to insist that fiction must promote a particular moral content. And that, I mean, that's so that when we talk about moral, that can mean sometimes people will say, well, moral has a, kind of has a certain frame. But I would encourage us, at least in this conversation, to consider moral to be how each individual understands what's right. And we're going to talk some about that. Instead, I'm asserting that real human life involves a continual flow of moral decisions, of considering or refusing to consider options as to what to say, what to do, and how to respond to life's sea of situations and relationships. Moralism is a particular moral framework or orthodoxy that prescribes and proscribes certain behaviors. Moralism is what makes moral seem like such a heavy word. The dark side of moralism is the arrogant oppression imposed by religious or political extremism. Moralism assumes that a particular set of moral choices is superior to other possibilities. Moralism intends to provide authoritative order for its adherents' daily choices. Moralism aims to minimize moral complexity and to provide orthodoxy that replaces individuals' decision-making on a moment-to-moment basis. Larding moralism onto a story's reader, saying, and the moral of the story is just the kind of burdensome, ham-handed disrespect that no reader wants to have to face. Real dynamic moral choices are really kind of define the process of being human. Philosophically, it's our choices that make us who we are. And the same is true of fictional characters. Many of our choices are low wattage items, like whether to have another bite of chicken before taking a sip of water. But we also make choices related to much more important issues, concerns that involve our most deeply held values. Sometimes we know that our choices will have very important ramifications and consequences. It's these pivotal choices based on what we deem to be our paramount values that give our lives meaning. And the same again is true of fictional characters. These are the kind of choices that ultimately define who we are. We humans, real and fictional, make and don't make moral choices based on our ignorance or awareness of issues and possibilities, our passivity or decisiveness, our pessimism or optimism, and our own particular view of what's important or good. I'm proposing that moral dilemma and choice are crucially important elements of all fiction. But in order to consider what's crucial to fiction, we have to define what we believe to be the excellence for fiction. What is going to be our standards that we apply to say whether something is crucially important to fiction or not. So what's important for fiction? Is it its memorability, its personal impact, its profits from sales or popularity, or its implications for deeper or broader meaning for us in our own understanding? What do you think, in your own mind, what would you say makes for fictional excellence? What's crucial to fiction? how do you judge whether whether a story is good or really valuable to you?
I've heard it called page turning interest. Something makes you turn the page. And you could almost make it as simple as that. What is that is what every hopeful novelist is trying to figure out.
Mhm.
I think of it in a different way.
Yeah.
I liked something that makes me think about how I can apply this in my own life. What have I seen in real life that would fit this scenario? And what have I read that changes the way I've thought about something? What did I learn from this author and the experience of these other people? And how can I use that example in my own life to maybe live a fuller or deeper or more understanding of a different set of people?
Yeah, so that connection of what the author's writing or presentation of a story, that its connection to your life, with the way you think about things.
Right, and maybe it's a different group of people that I've not thought about before, but all of a sudden I get a picture of what their thinking is, and I get a different perception and more understanding of a different way of thinking or living, and just a deeper appreciation for a different scenario than I've had before, so that I have growth from it. I learned something from it. It challenges my own thinking about what I've thought about a certain situation.
Good, thank you. Thank you, Sue.
Well, some of the things that I like in fiction are storylines or characters that surprise me, that take me places didn't think I was going to go. Also, where they're interesting and stimulating characters. Also like fiction that is historically and culturally accurate. I think about one of my all-time favorite books, Cold Mountain. And one of the things that makes it amazing is it's as if the author lived at the time and understood all the little tools and nuances and the phrases and phrasing of things that were really brought it alive. So those are a couple of things.
Yeah. Excellent.
I think again, for me, it's character development. You read these formula books, novels, and they're boring. It's like all the characters are kind of cutouts. They move through a plot, which you can almost figure out what's going to happen. And so, yeah, a book has to have some meat in it. It has to have some depth, has to have, the things obviously that we're reading about and for whom the bell tolls.
Well, what I know to be true about myself is when I read and I will make a snap judgment. Oh man, that was not a good thing to do, or oh, wasn't that perfect? And then as I read and I gain more information and I think, oh, but I'm changing my mind as I learn more. And that's what keeps me turning the pages, because I'm so quick to judge, and I'm generally wrong. So I kind of love that I'm taken to a further level or depth.
Yeah, there's evolution of the story's meaning for you as it goes. And thank you. These are all excellent views and excuse me, Linda.
Well, two things picking up on what other people said. My friend in the front row said she likes to go to a world that you're not familiar with and people you don't know anything about. That's certainly true with this novel, and including for the people reading it when it came out in 1940. Dynamite was unknown in World War I. So dynamite was like an atomic bomb would be a few years later. Well, and I don't think the atomic bomb had been developed yet in 1940. It was during the 40s, but not by 1940. So it was the most powerful explosive known to mankind. And here on 2 backpacks, he's got enough material to blow up a bridge across a whole canyon. It was just unbelievable to them at that time about the power. So will man be able to use that power for a good purpose and without losing control of it? So it's kind of is a universal question about mankind that everybody can connect with, but he's taking us into such an unusual world here where you visualize the tanks and and he's so detailed about the guns and the ammunition and the logistics and everything.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed it from that standpoint.
And when fiction's well done, it teaches us about the real world as well as
Yeah.
just a fictional world.
It's also been said, the other thing I was thinking is, it's also been said that the author is on the one hand leading the plot forward and on the other hand delaying it. Now on page 1, we know he's going to blow up a bridge. The bridge blows up in the middle of chapter 43 on page something like 430.
Mhm.
So what was he doing for 430
And
pages?
it's only a few days, actually, I think, to go by.
And
but
it's
not a
all
long-
compressed in 3 days. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you. For me, when I was thinking about this and trying to answer the same question, as a reader and as an aspiring writer, it's a story's memorability and its invitation into deeper meaning that make a story work for me. But all these, everything else you've mentioned, I share those views too. As readers, we're drawn to conflicts and choices that fictional characters have to make, their moral dilemmas. Fight or flee, love or leave, assist or abstain, act selfishly or act selflessly. What's most important to each character at any particular moment. Not only are we drawn to these dilemmas, but it is these predicaments and these moral choices that characters make in response that give the story impact and meaning. Flannery O'Connor was an acknowledged master of the short story. Her stories are among the most memorable and emotionally impactful that I've ever read. O'Connor's exposition of the morality of fiction is enlightening. She said, "It's a character's choice when faced with a crucial moral dilemma that elevates a story, the opportunity to transcend or fulfill her character. This opportunity for redemption," she called it, "is therefore different from a requirement that the character make a positive choice. It's just being faced with a choice and making a choice one way or the other. The limits of a short story generally limit the protagonist to a single moral turning point. But a novel, on the other hand, the length of a novel can expose or present multiple potential turning points and multiple pivotal moral dilemmas. And we'll see this exemplified in For Whom the Bell Tolls and the evolution of characters and of their attitudes and actions throughout the story. Stories depict characters in circumstances, often extreme circumstances that reveal, as Flannery O'Connor says, who they are essentially. Their responses, their moral choices are the crucial variables that every story has that involves real characters. It's what makes characters real, in fact. These are characters whose fictional depiction exposes not just their, but also often the reader's humanity. Perhaps the story's approach and capacity to open a reader's own humanity to him or herself through the moral decisions of the story's characters are the signal qualification of great literature. Moral dilemma and choice are central to the development of dramatic plot, character, and story meaning in fiction. Now let's close the PowerPoint now for a few minutes if we can. At this point, I want to spend some time with another fictional great, Ernest Hemingway, and looking at moral dilemma and choice in For Whom the Bell Tolls. For Whom the Bell Tolls, as you all know, is a novel about the heroic, troubled, and tragic involvements of the protagonist, a young American named Robert Jordan, in the Spanish Civil War of 1936 to 39. Jordan's an explosives expert who has joined the Republican struggle to preserve Spain's nascent democracy against overthrow by right-wing fascist nationalist forces. The novel follows Jordan's attachment to a Spanish guerrilla military band and his growing love for a damaged but beautiful Maria. For Whom the Bell Tolls may be read as a story about war and love and heroism. It can be read as historical fiction. It can be read as an ideological political tract or as an adventure story. Or like Macbeth, in the reference to Shakespeare, It can be appreciated as a drama driven by its by its pivotal characters' moral decisions. If we kind of try to look at a summary of the character development in Robert Jordan, it's Robert Jordan's continual embroilment in moral decisions and moral dilemmas and choices that make him real, and that empathetically draw the reader into his experience. And that's what makes a story, in my view, dramatically tense and meaningful. He's an authentically human character in that his choices are not predictable, and he changes, he evolves through the story as the story evolves. Robert's engagement in moral decisions and necessary choices is the matrix in which his character can change and grow. Character change, the crucial element of story, can develop only through the character's embrace, willing or not, no matter what becomes of those choices, of moral challenge. As in the real lives that we lead, the major characters in For Whom the Bell Tolls considers none of these values and moral priorities to be simple, isolated, either-or choices. They're always complicated. Each principle is always a value in competition with other different values. And then just wanted to talk again for a few minutes about your views of, in For Whom the Bell Tolls, what are some of the moral dilemmas that Robert Jordan and other characters face? You know, are there any that stood out for you?
Picking up on some of what you said, and I'd add to the storyline is in some ways it's autobiographical. And just looking at one example of a moral dilemma of suicide, when he considers it, but he also disdained his father because of suicide.
Yep.
But also in terms of the autobiographical, not so much if you were reading this in 1940, but reading it in 2021, it's hard not to think about Hemingway and what we all know of his character, of his personality, and kind of a man's man, you know, and that you almost can see him, unlike many authors, but can see him playing the role of Robert Jordan. And that comes into play as you think about some of the moral dilemmas that he either supports or underscores or dismisses, you know, like suicide and some of the other things in terms of war and the like.
From early on, the dilemma or the decision of what to do with Pablo, and the chapter that talks about everybody thought when Jordan was at the table and he was kind of getting his gun ready, and then the discussion of, well, we all thought you would do it, why didn't you do it? And I mean, all of that tension that just is, it's not time yet.
Yeah, and he really
Yeah.
struggles with this. You know,
Yeah.
there's the violence of war and the considerations of things like suicide and his struggling with whether or not to what would justify or what would not make it worth killing another person who's close to him.
And at that point, Jordan is pretty comfortable with not being able to justify that decision. And although everybody else is kind of pushing him to do that.
And as a reader, you may be pushing him to do it too. Yeah.
At one point, he is talking with, is it Anselo?
Yeah.
Anselmo?
Anselmo.
Anselo is comfortable killing animals, but not people, where Robert Jordan is the other way around. He wants to protect the animals, but he has, in his own moral decisions, has found that in this situation, killing, other than this situation with Pablo, that he's comfortable with that.
Right.
But the other comment I wanted to make, though, is very early on, everything, the morality in the book seems to be so oriented toward the war. killing, suicide. But at the very beginning, and I think this goes to Hemingway also, Robert Jordan makes the moral decision that he can tell Maria that he loves her in order so that she will have sex with him on the very first night that he meets her. So that the role of the woman, the morality related to a woman is another strain throughout the book.
I agree. Yeah, one more. Oh, yeah. Yeah, go, please go ahead. Yes.
When I think of the moral concerns, I think about how the book illustrates that so many of these things are situational. You know, the fact that there would be no inclination, perhaps, we don't know much about Robert growing up, but probably no inclination on him to tell a woman he loves her. But the powerful and the presence of near presence of death and what's going to happen next, that could change. And it changes the situation, and that he could make a different decision than what he would have made at another time. And then as he interacts with the other characters and learns about the gypsies and the native people and how much love he has for the Spaniards in general, and then what he feels the effects of the communists that kind of run the Republican side, you know, he comes to these dilemmas. And so see, these are some of the other moral concerns faced by him. And that by and large, things are so different in war than they are in peace. It's almost impossible to even compare the two when you're in there.
Okay. Yeah, my mother has described to me just how during World War II, it seemed so different. Things were moving fast, but it was also the future is so unknowable and unknown and uncertain that you know, she met my father, and a few months later they were married. And I think you know, they were married for, you know, the next whatever it was, 60 70 years. But without the war, that, you know, that probably would have been a different, you know, kind of much more protracted kind of courtship thing. And but it was just it was the war. And people at home, any comments anybody like to make? Well, here's my own list of some of these moral issues, and I want to flip the PowerPoint back on now. Thank you, Susan. Oops, wait a minute, back. Okay, here we are. Yeah, so if this is a list that I made up with, you know, many of which you've already mentioned. One is whether and under what conditions and to what ends and with what limits to engage in violence, and especially killing other people. Another would be whether and under what conditions to choose suicide and or the mercy killing of one person or another. And a third would be how and if people can overcome privileged capitalist oppression to realize egalitarian justice. Another would be choosing between and balancing the conflicting values of corporate morality and individual morality. Another would be the relative value of independent sole responsibility in action versus other competing values, or the value of duty, especially relative to loyalty to others and self-risk and to committed personal love. The relative value of self-sacrifice versus competing values. The relative value of merit, of ability and accomplishments versus other competing values. The relative value of dignity compared to other things. The maintenance or erosion or collapse of faith at its intersection with disillusionment. The values of tolerance and mutual respect versus the value of bigotry. the immorality of arrogance, the conditions of forgiveness, which was something that Robert struggled with. He struggled with the idea of forgiveness at its base, and the risks posed by kindness, caring, and love to values of accomplishment and emotional detachment. Neither we nor fictional characters make ethical decisions in a vacuum. Our perceptions of moral concerns and those of fictional characters are strongly influenced by Western moral frames. When we face unexpected or important feeling circumstances, we and fictional characters try to understand and decide what to do, and then draw on our internalized voices of wisdom to do this. But these voices of wisdom are often conflicting and very varied. Parents' repeated advice, religious codes, peers' expectations, searing personal experience, and prevalent cultural and social norms jostle and chirp to make their values heard every time we need to make a value decision. In this internal clamor, philosophical cultural norms are loud voices. And so I wanted to kind of just to talk for a few minutes about some of these kind of frames of reference, frames of moral reference that we have. These philosophical influences evolve and are strongly evident in Robert Jordan's thoughts and decisions. In the American society in which Robert was raised, a variety of mutually incompatible philosophical frames guided moral thinking. And Robert, like everybody else, like all of us, subconsciously juggles the priorities of these ethical systems as he contends with tough decisions. Jordan's moral views and choices, his character, evolve as the story unfolds. What are the moral systems vying for Robert Jordan's attention? These moral frames prominently include classical Greek, utilitarian, libertarian, Kantian, capitalist, Marxist, American frontier, and social democratic philosophies, all with different concepts of what's right to do. Western culture has incorporated Greek philosophies that esteem virtue and merit. Aristotle and Plato proposed that a just society should reward individuals according to their merits, especially their accomplishments. Greek philosophy held that the most virtuous, accomplished people should receive more of society's goods and offices and powers. Greek virtues included courage, temperance, justice, and wisdom, and Greek philosophy shows up in Robert Jordan's high respect for self-governance, for honor, for expertise, and for the accomplishment of goals. Dominant Christian cultures have promoted a different culture of moral weights: self-sacrifice, service to others, guilt, probity and suppression of emotional display, sexual repression, humility, and subservience to authority. Robert Jordan claims to be unreligious, but he clearly values self-sacrifice and service to others. Since the 18th century, Enlightenment, individualism, and rationalism have opened space for the development of new philosophies of morality and social justice. The foundations of modern democracy, of liberty and moral justice, of economic dynamics, and the confrontations between autocracy and populism are all rooted in the Enlightenment's reliance on human thought and agency. Robert Jordan is an Enlightenment man, like Ernest Hemingway, an Enlightenment man who believes in independent self-determination rather than submission to religious or state authority. Utilitarianism proposes maximizing society's overall happiness or pleasure and minimizing society's overall suffering and pain, the notion of the greatest good for the greatest number. In For Whom the Bell Tolls, Jordan's utilitarianism shows up in his conviction that death for some can yield net benefit for the rest. His willingness to sacrifice his own life for the cause of Spanish liberty is strongly utilitarian as well as Christian. Kantian reliance on human rationality and the acceptance of universal law above legislative codes underlie Jordan's self-reliance and hope to act rightly. But he makes moral judgments based on momentary circumstances, as when he considers assassinating Pablo. Market capitalism orders morality around the supply and demand of labor, capital, and goods and services. And Robert accepts the system that he grew up knowing. On the other hand, Marxism contests the dehumanization of people's efforts and needs and aspirations. And Robert's and Hemingway's moral code opposes the immorality of capitalism's excesses. Robert claims to himself that he's not a real Marxist, but his moral foundation is significantly Marxist also. Having witnessed capitalism run amok in the generation of the Great War, the market boom and collapse of the 20s and the Depression, Robert believes in revolution to unseat fascist oppression and achieve populist governance. He believes in the high value of individuals' labor over the accumulated capital power of privileged overlords. Libertarianism is another strong element of Robert Jordan's character. Libertarianism prioritizes each person's rightful control over his or her own person and property. And in the last century has added antagonism versus the obligations and restrictions imposed by government. Robert, who thinks of himself as a libertarian, and he identifies this quite clearly, upholds the rightness of self-reliant, independent decision and action. Libertarian ideals propelled his headstrong departure from Montana and from his Montana teaching life to join the Spanish anti-fascist cause. But he also strongly values the anti-libertarian value of sacrificing for the common good. The ethical principles of social democracy, promoted by the American philosopher John Rawls and others, have evolved in philosophical response to the perceived inadequacies of utilitarianism, libertarianism, capitalism, and Marxism. Social democracy's moral framework for social justice prioritizes fairness, equity of opportunity, especially for people disadvantaged by circumstances out of their own control, circumstances like skin color, lack of inherited wealth, physical or mental makeup, or handicap, poor access to education, etc. And for whom the bell tolls, Robert Jordan hates oppression and hopes for social justice broader than that founded in capitalism or Marxism. He hopes for democratically equal opportunity for what he calls a fair piece of the pie. When he internally wrestles with the moral wrongs of the revolution and war in which he's enveloped, he's listening to social democratic values. Like Robert Jordan, real people like us and fictional real characters constantly vacillate and select among various philosophical frames of justice. We make many moral decisions without being consciously aware of all the conflicting philosophical voices whispering in our heads. These things float around and generally, I'm not thinking of these frames when I'm trying to figure things out, but they're all bouncing up against me. The writer of fiction must embrace and explore the unique unpredictability of his or her characters, developing real human complexity made of conflicting interests and values. Hemingway's Robert Jordan is an exemplar of this kind of character, knowable and seemingly consistent, but unpredictable and internally driven by his own singular shifting jumble of moral priorities. And then, how do Hemingway's exploration of moral themes and moral dilemmas and choices relate to the development of character, plot, and meaning in For Whom the Bell Tolls? And I've got a bunch of kind of examples I'm going to kind of walk through here. In reading For Whom the Bell Tolls, the reader comes to clearly understand that Robert Jordan represents much of what Hemingway himself values in character and commitments and moral values. In the course of the story's dramatic events and Jordan's internal monologues, Hemingway reveals his character's shifting moral processes and priorities, and they seem to ally with much of what we know about Hemingway himself. Like every protagonist, Jordan's moral predicaments and moral choices shape his development of character and the story's plot and meaning. From the novel's opening scene to its last, when Robert draws his killing bead on the noble enemy of Lieutenant Berindo, Robert Jordan spars and struggles with the moral implications of killing other people. Robert has no compunction against killing enemy soldiers in the necessary achievement of his design demolition tasks. Early in the novel, in chapter 3, Robert engages in a long conversation with the wise old partisan trooper Anselmo. Robert says, "I do not like to kill animals." Anselmo responds, "I don't like to kill men." Robert then explains his complete willingness to kill men for the cause. And Anselmo describes his feelings of noble reverence for the great animals that he's hunted and killed. But the killing of a man, Anselmo continues, of that there is nothing good that remains. To me, it is a sin to kill a man. And in this, and talking about this, and through these characters, Hemingway is exposing, this moral dilemma, and it's a moral dilemma that Robert gradually engages more as the story goes on. Anselmo says, even fascists whom we must kill. Robert draws a strong moral divide between necessary killing for the cause and officers' killing of their own misbehaving soldiers, which he views with disgust. Robert's concern about the rightness of the killing he must do collides with his values of loyalty and aversion to unnecessary violence. In two major scenes, one in chapter 5 and the other in chapters 16, 17, Robert recognizes the operational need to kill the troop leader Pablo. But both times he stops short, deterred by the task's cold-blooded violation of community loyalty. In these scenes, Robert's character wrestles with the moral priorities of honor, duty, and loyalty to community, and the flip sides of those values: dishonor, irresponsibility, and betrayal. Later in chapter 26, after his faith in the cause has eroded, Robert argues with himself that his justification for killing people with his bombs is false. Blowing the trains, you kill many, he says, he thinks to himself. And of those, how many were real fascists? He then tells himself, no man has the right to take another man's life unless it is to prevent something worse happening to other people. Utilitarian, but he's having difficulty here. Through the dramatic course of For Whom the Bell Tolls, Robert must deal more and more directly with his previously resolved justification for killings of others. His moral tension pulls the reader into his quandary. In chapter 10, Pilar's long narrative about the start of the Spanish Revolutionary movement in her hometown exposes the ugly brutality of violence, even when for the cause, even when it unseats vicious oppression. Pilar's story, which is a centerpiece of Hemingway's novel, shines harsh light on many forms of violence, among them arrogant neglect, recrimination, revenge, mockery, dishonor, mob violence, killing of innocents, killing for pleasure, and humiliation. This story within a story lays bare for Robert the subversion of good by violence and the sad perversion of oppression's victims eagerly rising to become tyrants themselves. Pilar's account of that day, which is, I don't know, what is it? It's like a 30-page piece of the novel or something like that. And of its ghastly futility after the fascists retook the town 3 days later, thrusts forward Robert's disillusionment and shifting moral foundations. Robert critiques his own cause's nobility and doubts his own judgment as he faces the conflict between his trusted values of duty, honor in combat, self-reliance, and sacrifices, and the new values he's surprised to hold so dear: community loyalty and committed love for Maria. Hemingway's second theme of disillusionment rises progressively throughout For Whom the Bell Tolls, at first creeping into the reader's vision, but gradually accelerating as the moral ambiguities and treacheries inside his trusted cause encroach on Robert's faith and erode his established moral positions. After hearing Pilar's story in chapter 11, about the grotesque revolutionary violence in Avila, Robert realizes he has isolated himself from the personal nature of his killing, both by the nature of his skills and by his rapid escapes. His sense of accountability for individual deaths grows to haunt him as the story progresses. His growing disrespect for the efficiency and courage of the people he's dedicated to help also gnaws at Robert's confident dedication to duty, as he gradually recognizes that his revered cause, the Spanish Revolution and Spanish republicanism, is corrupt at many levels and is far removed from the local communities of people he hopes to serve. He struggles internally to rationalize his part in the repugnance of war's violence and corruption, and to hold on to his sense of honorable duty. In chapter 18, he thinks to himself, "You corrupt very easily. I know that we did dreadful things to them too." And he concludes that the ethics of the cause won't matter if he and the others can blow up the bridge successfully. And he kind of just narrows it down to just whether he can accomplish that or not. But his idealism has been burned. The night before he must blow up the bridge, in chapter 34, Robert despairs at his own failure to do away with Pablo, who has betrayed the rebel band and has thrown away most of his explosives to do the job. "Oh, muck this whole treachery-ridden country, muck their egotism and their selfishness, muck them before we die for them. I will do the bridge with what we have. We'll all be killed, but we'll blow the bridge." Robert's private moral tremors draw the reader into his character, into the emotional drama of his physical danger, and hook the reader's own moral discernment as you try to figure out what you think he should do, what you hope he does and doesn't do. On the eve of the story's climax, in chapter 26, Robert tells himself, "You have no right to shut your eyes to any of it, nor any right to forget any of it or to soften it." Robert's moral turmoil is entirely necessary for the story's heroic conclusion to rise above melodrama and deliver meaning to the reader. The reader engages Robert's moral dilemmas with him. Other characters present other disillusionments in the course of For Whom the Bell Tolls, especially those driving Pilar from religious faith into bitter anger at the church's participation in fascism, and Anselmo from religious faith to saddened atheism. The war's treacherous inhumanity turns nearly all from fervent trust in the Republican cause to bitter distrust of war and hope for mere community survival. Suicide and mercy killing are a thematic concern related to but separate from other killing for Robert and for Hemingway. Robert's own father committed suicide, as did Hemingway's. Robert tells Maria in chapter 30, his father shot himself to avoid being tortured by his wife. But Robert considers his father a coward for not handling his disillusionment in a more forthright, courageous way. In For Whom the Bell Tolls, Robert defers for himself a decision about the potential rightness of suicide in order to elude capture and torture, but would do anything to prevent the possibility of betraying his comrades under torture. He talks with his friend Kharkov about carrying a cyanide capsule in chapter 18. Throughout the novel, Robert, Pablo, Pilar, and others repeatedly refer to the story of Kashkin, Robert's fellow dynamiter for the partisans whom Robert killed, he later admits, when the injured Kashkin pleaded for death to avoid the pain of torture after being captured by the enemy. Robert would choose also to die, if possible, to avoid this betrayal of his own ideals as well as his compatriots, but would much rather die in battle rather than in his own hand. However, Robert's moral views about suicide and mercy killing are later tested when he falls in love with Maria, and in chapter 13, she demands that he promise the same homicidal courtesy for her. He will be forced to adjust his moral priorities to make room for his commitment to deep love for Maria. Eventually, of course, in the novel's climax, Robert surrenders himself to death to save Maria and the others. Hemingway develops ethical complexities for many other rounded, dynamic characters in For Whom the Bell Tolls. Pablo, Pilar, Anselmo, and to a lesser degree, Maria, contend with ethical predicaments and make moral decisions that make them real and that feed the plot's drama and strengthen the meaningful impact of the novel. For Whom the Bell Tolls is rich in moral confrontations and contradictions, all embodied in its characters. Old Anselmo brings forward the moral theme of repentance and reconciliative justice, a strong counterpoint to Hemingway's dominant themes of duty, loyalty versus betrayal, independent responsibility, courage, and war for egalitarian socioeconomic justice. If I live later, Anselmo tells Robert in chapter 3, I will try to live in such a way, doing no harm to anyone, that I will be forgiven. Robert considers forgiveness exaggerated, a Christian notion. Later in chapter 15, Anselmo ruminates, I think after the war, there will have to be some great penance, some civic penance organized that all may be cleansed for the killing, or else we will never have a true and human basis for living. Anselmo's abhorrence of the violence in which he's engaged and his hope for post-war healing added to Robert's reverence for Anselmo gives For Whom the Bell Tolls additional moral weight and complexity, and even presages the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions of the past 27 years around the world. Ernest Hemingway and his avatar, Robert Jordan, are fervent advocates of individual liberty. At the story's beginning, Jordan's independence and commitment to personal principles are absolute, and he doesn't question himself, they're quite clear to him. But through his exposure to the injustices done to Spain's peasants, the excesses of Spanish privilege, and his intimacies with wise old Anselmo and tough Pilar and lovely Maria and others, Robert finds himself seeking some balance between his autonomous liberty and commitment to the common good, especially in a close community. Before blowing the bridge, he rages against the egotistical, treacherous swine who have governed Spain, and also against the evil Pablo. But he thinks, look at all the good ones. Look at all the fine ones. He could not bear to be unjust. Here, Robert duels internally with his moral shift from duty and cause to the small community of the rebel band, and the reader duels along with him. A final theme to consider is Robert's uncharacteristic, surprising love for Maria. At its beginning, the novel presents Robert as a man who prizes his emotional detachment and single-minded commitment to his chosen military duty. He knows only two rules for getting, this is a quote, two rules for getting along well with people who speak Spanish. Give the men tobacco and leave the women alone. And he tells beautiful but damaged Maria, I have no time for any woman. Not only does the rigidly self-disciplined Robert fall in love with Maria, he recognizes and enters into meeting her need for healing, and eventually determines to tie himself to her with loyal, unqualified commitment. Robert's love for Maria changes him and complicates his story, pitting his commitments as a dynamiter for the Spanish partisans against his commitment to what life, however brief, he might have with Maria, and to somehow ensuring Maria's survival. Robert's resulting moral dilemmas and choices become the stronger half of his story For Whom the Bell Tolls, throwing his established moral structure into conflict with this new vital inner life. Robert debates with himself whether a few days of the fullness of committed love can be enough, because only then can he fulfill his commitment to dynamite the bridge, an event which is an event from which he's convinced he will not escape alive. He hopes for more, for a future with Maria, but is anxious most of all for her survival. The moral upheaval in Robert, triggered by Maria and their love for each other, ratchets the story's dramatic tension upward to the climax. As Robert Jordan forges through all of these ethical quandaries and internal arguments, the reader mentally walks in his footsteps, not necessarily empathizing entirely with Robert, but perceiving and considering Robert's decisions and actions page by page as they're made. The reader's understanding of Robert's complexity, of Robert's history, strengths, weaknesses, and shifting understanding of himself and his tasks in the world expands. Robert's moral dilemmas and choices change him, and his character evolution both ramps up the story's dramatic tension and plants its significance deeper into the reader's memory. Now, if we close the PowerPoint again. Let's see. I was going to open it once more. Okay. Robert Jordan's moral dilemmas and For Whom the Bell Tolls personalize and bring forward in our minds some of the same moral quandaries that we face today in our society and in the world. What collateral damage killing of innocence is acceptable? We hear about collateral damage in drone shots and things. And for what ends is this justifiable? Thinking of private and militia ownership of firearms, what kind of violence is morally acceptable in our society? And for what ends? Who should be allowed to control the means of violence? And for what reasons? Another question, how much patriotic faith in one's country is justified? And again, for what justifications? Is suicide a right of the individual? Should our society expand its allowances for euthanasia? Where is the ideal balance between individual liberty and communal needs? Where is the best balance between the capitalist dedication to profit and the common good, or the needs of people who lack capital? Is violence justified and worth its carnage in order to overthrow political opponents? In addition to character development and dramatic progression, Robert Jordan's welter of moral quandaries and judgments in For Whom the Bell Tolls and its mixture of dramatic results arising from his unpredictable human decisions are crucial for the story's development of meaning and enduring impact in the reader's memory and connection to the reader's own life. Without its embrace of moral complexities, For Whom the Bell Tolls would fall from literary greatness to mere adventure tripe. Robert Jordan himself is indelibly memorable because he constantly contends with moral predicaments. But Hemingway's evocative presentation of war's glory and horror, revolution's inspiring purpose and disgusting corruption, and human nobility and inhumanity, all are made intimately real in the moral choices made by his characters and create enduring meaning. Now, as a counterpoint, I wanted to just consider some other views of fiction that kind of eschew moral dilemma. Is there, when I think about this, I think, is there a difference between fiction and story? For me, they're the same pretty much. I think of the story as is what I look for in fiction, but it's not the same for everybody. Then the question of whether fiction cannot be a story is a real question. A story has dramatic arc, some meaningful course connecting the beginning to the end. A story goes somewhere, and that somewhere involves some kind of moral moment. Is there such a thing as a fiction that has no sense of story? I guess now I want to turn the PowerPoint back on. Excuse me. Thank you, Susan.
No problem.
Okay. John Gardner wrote a book entitled On Moral Fiction, And in that book, he insisted that all art and all fiction must by its nature move society toward good. I don't buy this. The argument seems to me kind of self-defining, circular, tautological. You know, he says that that it has to be good, therefore it has to be moral. Fiction's confrontation of moral dilemma is not the same as fiction being moral in overall content or theme. That's kind of where I differ from Gardner. There is such a thing as amoral fiction. A good example is Joyce Carol Oates' book Zombie, about a character, rapist turned serial killer, that disjointedly and unquestioningly records his own obsessions, fantasies, and bizarre mental twists, but without any engagement of what to do or whether something would be better than something else. Absent any moral questions, such writing to me resembles journalism more than story. In real life, Adolf Hitler would be an example. Even people who commit grotesque, terrible crimes hold beliefs about the rightness of their judgments and actions. Such characters can embrace what they perceive to be moral choices. But when a story's characters feel, think, decide, and act in a moral void, they become creatures at a kind of subhuman evolutionary level. Do moray eels worry about the moral ramifications of their predation? How engaging is a story about zombies who have no moral capacity? Metafiction is another kind of category of what some would contend to be amoral fiction. William Gass and John Barth are prominent authors who argued against the insistence on morality in fiction. Gass was a philosopher of language, and he argues in Fiction and the Figures of Life that fiction is purely aesthetic, and that language in fiction should create an imaginary world without attempting to represent the world we know. His fiction manipulates and invents words to metaphorically represent ideas and imagined realities. Gass considers any presumption of logical or consequential order in fiction to be stifling, and insists that plot and moral responsibility are insignificant. John Barth contended that conventional fiction could no longer be original. It had all been used up. We've heard it all before. His inventive fiction often parodies story and satirizes traditional story form and conventions of fiction. His stories are essentially unreadable satires of conventional writing, larded and inspissated with mythological allusions, archaic language, and self-referential metalepsis ad nauseum to me. Metafictional reflection of reflection, wordplay, and satire of literature to me, seems to be a fascinating kind of game and can work as philosophical essay, but strain and fail as fiction as I understand fiction. Metafiction can only remove itself from moral import by removing itself from human conditions. I contend that the word fiction has to mean something else, has to contend somehow with human conditions, or cease to be useful at all. And the meaning of fiction that I understand has to do with story, a perceivable reality, believable, even if fanciful, characters, and some events in which those characters participate. Experimental fiction includes pieces that veer from one reality to another, or begin what appears to be a somewhat conventional story, but omits anything like an ending. Some experimental fiction attempts to expose truth or depict human emotional vulnerability without involving its characters in moral questioning or response. But such stories' lack of engagement with the turning point choices by their characters leaves them disjointedly vague, lacking dramatic strength and meaning. And here I'll close the PowerPoint again. I do believe that moral dilemma and choice are crucially, centrally important elements of every story, and that an author must embrace his characters' moral dilemmas in order to create a compelling, meaningful story. Having said this, I'm eager to hear of your own ideas, whether they're, contrary or consistent. And so I just want to kind of open the rest of the class to discussion about this idea.
One thing I found kind of frustrating about the story is that I felt like most of the things that he was doing were other people's ideas. Like he didn't seem to have much autonomy. And so, his decision-making, I felt like was a little not up to him almost. So I don't know what that means for the morality of it, but I felt like it was all kind of out of his hands. And sort of a tangent to that, I kind of felt like the love story was maybe added later. Like it felt out of sync with the rest of the book to me. It would have been more boring without it. But I just wonder if an editor or somebody said, you need to get a little romance in here. That's kind of how it felt to me.
The romantic thing with Maria, to me, was another thing that seemed autobiographical, because Hemingway's approach to his own love affairs throughout his life seemed to be entirely selfish, he seemed himself to have this emotional disengagement from people that, and in the story, it's as if Robert is moving toward engagement, but it's not easy, and it's not intuitive for him, and I think it's not intuitive for the author. That was how I saw that. Linda?
I thought about some of those things too, because love and war are paired up in so many different great stories. But I thought that the novel I knew of best of Hemingway was A Farewell to Arms, when we started all this, and I hadn't read For Whom the Bell Tolls back in college or whatever. In A Farewell to Arms, I think it's more true that the war is just kind of a backdrop, and the war interferes with a beautiful love story. That's kind of the way you feel at the end. But in this story, Maria comes in a time and in a way that, even though we're supposed to believe that the love of his life appeared and everything was fulfilled in less than 3 days, we can accept that because of the way because of the way the characters are treated and developed within the pages and the slow pacing of those 3 days. So I thought that the plot with Maria was one more way in which at the end he's saying, we can part because I am you and you are me. It's one more way in which no man is an island, when the man decides to be able to find himself by giving up himself, and that sort of thing. Sort of another way of playing on the theme of how connected he is by the end of the novel. So I felt that the two achieve a higher artistic union here. Not that there weren't plenty of editors, in Westerns or whatever, who said, yeah, only the men are going to go to this Western unless you put a love theme in there, so we have to have a girl, But it's so much ahead of that, because Maria is pretty fully developed. I think their relationship in the narrow frame is pretty fully developed.
I kind of subscribe to the philosophy that a good book reads you. If you've ever heard that expression, it's not a new one. And I think one of the ways moral fiction like this, kind of how you define it as good, as whether it's good fiction or not, is whether or not it withstands the test of time. And as you read a book like this, sometimes the themes don't come to you immediately. They may come to you through a discussion like this, and that you feel like you've been here before when you experience something now, and where you really may have experienced it before in terms of the muscle memory comes from reading, in many cases, fiction. So fast forward to January 6th. And the people that travel from all over the country, like Robert Jordan, to Spain, because they believed in a cause, gave up what they were doing, put a lot on the line. I'm not supportive of January 6th, but it helps you maybe understand over a 1 day period, or
Mhm.
maybe 3 days going and coming, a period not any different than the 3 days in this book
Mhm.
of some of all the issues that are at play. And we are spectators, much the same as American public, or many are spectators or legislators, whatever, trying to understand and unbundle and see what are the moral issues related to that, as well as political issues. So I think it's an excellent piece of fiction because it helps you understand current events, because it builds the muscle memory to go through the same thought process again in evaluating things that happen today, much the same as Robert Kincaid through Ernest Hemingway's writing did the same thing in 1940.
And anybody at home? Go ahead and unmute and speak up if you'd like to say something. Amy, your point about the love story seeming almost like it was added on by an editor. I can see that. I can see that point, that possibility too, especially because the ending needs something other than just, being crippled by a horse, by the horse breaking his leg and lying there and trying to save Pablo and his cohort. The love story certainly, it makes it into an ending that's quite memorable, and brings forward other moral, ethical questions.
I kept wondering too, why doesn't one of those other people kill Pablo? Why is it up to him? But everybody had expectations of him, stuff that they wanted
Mhm.
him to do.
Yeah, he was an avowed agent of violence. Yes.
Reading the notes online, they mentioned the rabbit image of Maria,
Mhm.
he called her rabbit. And then the killing of the rabbits in the snow and how much that had bothered, of course, Robert. And so it does it fits together, all these little pieces that you probably could read this many times to pick it all up. And of course, I think there's always a conflict between community and our own individual desires or what we think we need to do. And I think community becomes more important to Robert. And also his his connection with nature comes
Mhm.
out. They talked about the Native American,
Mhm.
they talked about the gypsies and how he begins to become part of the earth, so to speak, a reality, not just an ideal.
Mhm. Yes, I think those are all strong points as well. Well, thank you all very much. There's time for more comments if you'd like, but this has been fun for me to hear your thoughts, and I appreciate your involvement with the class and with the preparation for it. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom.
Tom, thank you very much. You've certainly helped me appreciate the book much more and develop a very deep understanding of it that I'm not sure that I had before. I just want to ask you one question. I watched the Ken Burns Hemingway documentary that detailed much of his misogyny and drinking and so on. And it affected the way I feel about Hemingway's works. I don't feel the same way about him after knowing, okay, just so what a rotten person he was. I feel
Right.
the same way about Woody Allen. I used to love Woody Allen movies, and now I just can't watch them anymore after seeing, Alan Farrell. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, yeah, certainly the authors that I really admire as people, it makes it easier to engage their ideas. I guess on the other hand, in reading this story and other Hemingway novels too, and short stories, it's easy for me to enter the story and to not think about about Hemingway as an individual, but just to maybe engage in the story. And that must be, it must be that there are other authors who are imperfect models of humanity as well. But yeah, I think if you get a strong kind of coloring of your view of an author, then that you can't disengage from that and not have that color of the what you see of his or her ideas. Yes.
This is kind of off the track, but since we're finishing up, the setting and the view of Spain and the Civil War and the ultimate success of Franco. I spent my junior year in Madrid in 66, 67. And even then, the impact of the Civil War was so strong. We were, it was at the University of Madrid, but it was a group of American students with a very eminent history professor. And it was getting toward the end of the semester. And he was dragging on and on about the early 20th century. And finally, someone spoke up and said, well, when are we going to talk about the Civil War? And he was a small, just very eminent little old man. He said, we do not talk about the Civil War. No, over 20 years
I'm
later.
sure it wasn't terribly safe to talk about it. Yeah.
No,
So kind of like Cambodia has been since their terrible civil war. People living side by side, some of whom were perpetrators against the others, never talk about it. Yes.
Getting back to Hemingway as the imperfect vessel of the book, writer of the book, I guess something struck me. I wonder if the character of Pablo represents Hemingway's side of himself that he finds disgusting but can't seem to get rid of, because he keeps going, like you said, go back to drinking and all these other things. So I get a sense that maybe that was part of his thinking and creating the characters represent perhaps different sides of the writer.
Yeah. Well, maybe, all of you may be writers as well. I don't know, but it's hard to write without being autobiographical. And to understand a character, it would have to come from somewhere, that understanding.
I have a short comment. I don't know if you guys can hear me or not. Can you?
Yes.
My father was of the builder generation and just saw the last end of World War II. And he was not a man that read a lot, but he always told me that Hemingway was by far his favorite author. And he would say that he just wanted to live a life just like Hemingway. And finally, I challenged him when he got older and I was older enough to speak back to him and said, what is it that you like about this man? He's a man that was totally unfaithful to his wife, had multiple affairs and promiscuousness, and drank a lot. And as far as I know, did not have a good relationship with his kids if he had any. And basically, when life got too hard, shot himself. So I said, what is it about this man that you admire? And he really was hard put to come up with anything.
But the rugged individualism thing was certainly a major theme in the first half of the century. From Teddy Roosevelt on, and probably I'm sure before him, the kind of this frontier ethic of being utterly independent and self-reliant and all that kind of stuff. And Hemingway certainly championed those values, whether they were accurately about him or not. Yes,
Tom.
Jane.
First of all, I am so impressed by how much material you had and how fast you read it to us. I mean, you left me way back here. I mean, thank you for your knowledge. Thank you for presenting this to us. Diana, I need to say, I feel the same way. I saw the Ken Burns. I used to teach Old Man in the Sea, little book, easy to do, and loved it. And I have read the other books, but what you said, that affected me too, reading For Whom the Bell Tolls. And I thought, I don't even like this guy, but I could see him from that Ken Burns showing up all over the place in For Whom the Bell Tolls. And another thing that was said was about the time when, you know, when we were reading the book, when For Whom the Bell Tolls was written, we didn't know what would be the end of Hemingway. We didn't know that he would succumb to the hateful suicide that he so held against his father. So there all this complexity. There's just all this complexity. And I thank you for bringing this moral dilemma to us, because for me, it's always been pretty simple. Good, bad, no, yes. And there's so much more. And I know that, but you even brought more than that.
Oh,
Thank
thank
you.
you. Thank you. Well,
And I
thank.
know we already clapped you, but we'll
Uh,
clap you
no.
again.
Oh,
I'm going to make one other comment. I
Jen.
read Sun Also Rises, and that's really pretty autobiographical about his own life and his life with his first wife and then meeting his second wife. And it's, if you read some of the descriptions, I think it's about Hadley. I can't remember. Anyway, I read about the second wife, and it's just really so much of what's in that book was real life experiences of how he was living his life at the time. It's kind of interesting. And he did use his own life a lot to write the books, that's for sure. And especially in The Sun Also Rises, and about this being to Spain and the drinking and meeting with one wife and then meeting the second, and etc. And if you read anything from the women's perspectives, it foreshadows the book. It's interesting.
thank you very much, Sue. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
Bye.